The old sedan coughed its way up the final stretch of gravel, spitting dust and loose stones as it went. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the silence of the Pacific Northwest wilderness pressing in on me, like a physical weight. Blackwood Manor. It sounded like something out of a gothic novel, and judging by the winding, overgrown drive, it was determined to live up to its name. The isolation was exactly what I'd been looking for. A fresh start, a place where the air wasn't thick with ghosts of my own making, where every shadow didn't twist into a familiar, agonizing shape. My great-aunt Alara's mysterious death had opened this door, a strange inheritance I hadn't expected. I'd only met her twice, a fleeting, almost uncomfortable memory of an intensely private woman with eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. He was a botanist, they said, a recluse, and this estate was her world. Now, it was mine. The image of a prison yard in thick fog, the blurred figures, the distant, muffled commands. That was the real reason I was here, fleeing a landscape of concrete and sorrow, hoping the verdant wilderness could somehow absorb the stain of what I'd left behind. I shook my head, pushing the image back into the mental vault where I kept such things. No, this was different. This was new. The car crested a final rise, and then, through a curtain of ancient sears and dripping moss, it appeared. It wasn't a house, it was a behemoth. 3 stories of weathered gray stone, topped with a slate roof that sagged in places like a weary shoulder. Turrets, gables, and countless windows stared out from behind a tangle of ivy that seemed to be actively trying to reclaim the structure. The sheer scale of it stole my breath. It was magnificent in a decaying, defiant way, like an old monarch refusing to abdicate. A sense of awe mingled with a distinct prickle of unease. It felt less like an empty dwelling and more like a sleeping giant, disturbed. I killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the drip of moisture from the saturated canopy and the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. Stepping out, the air hit me a rich, earthy scent, heavy with pine and damp soil, but also something else. Something subtly sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit or decaying flowers. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly, but it was persistent, clinging to the back of my throat. The gardens, Alara's famed gardens, were less cultivated beauty and more untamed jungle. Rhododendrons the size of small cars exploded in riotous, faded blooms. Ferns unfurled their fronds with prehistoric languor, and unknown vines snaked across the ground, thick as my arm, disappearing into the undergrowth. This wasn't just neglected, it was wild. It felt like a deliberate choice, not simply an oversight. I walked toward the front door, my boots crunching on the gravel. The path was barely visible, swallowed by creeping moss. The grand oak door, studded with rusted iron, stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me in, or perhaps as if it had been forced open by something that didn't bother with latches. I hesitated, a shiver tracing its way up my spine. Pushing the door open fully, it groaned, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the cavernous entry hall. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and that same sweet, earthy scent, now more pronounced. Sunlight, fractured and weak, struggled through grimy leaded glass windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the gloom. Cobwebs draped from every chandelier and corner, glistening like forgotten silver. I ran a hand over a dusty console table. This place had been untouched for a long time, yet it didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. I wandered deeper, past a grand staircase whose banister was carved with an intricate, unsettling motif of twisted vines and stylized thorns. The details were exquisite, but they held a sharpness, a predatory edge that made me pull my hand back. It wasn't ivy. Its leaves were a deep, almost black green, thick and fleshy, with delicate tendrils that seemed to pulse faintly in the meager light. It grew not from a pot, nor from a crack in the wall leading outside, but directly from the wood itself, seemingly fused with the ancient paneling. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through one of its thicker stalks. It wasn't just growing, it was breathing. A sudden, soft thud came from upstairs, followed by a rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a floor. My head snapped up, my heart giving a hard, unwelcome thump against my ribs. I stood absolutely still, straining to hear over the sudden rush of blood in my ears. Only the persistent, subtle hum of the old house, a low vibration I felt more than heard, like a distant, slumbering beast. The air, heavy with that strange, sweet smell, seemed to press closer. Alara wasn't just a botanist, he was tending something here, and whatever it was, it felt very much awake. I was here for a fresh start, but the house, I realized, was already starting something new with me. Blackwood Manor. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms, felt heavier here, closer to the house. I killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was profound, broken only by the distant murmur of the forest. The manor loomed, a hulking silhouette against the bruised sky, its many windows like vacant eyes. A shiver, not entirely from the evening chill, traced its way down my spine. This wasn't just an old house, it was a presence. My breath plumed in the cool air as I stepped out, stretching muscles stiff from the long drive. I retrieved my single bag from the back seat, the weight of it a familiar comfort. I hesitated, then pushed it open. No lock, no resistance. Just a slow, protesting groan of ancient hinges. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and something else. Something green and earthy, like a forgotten terrarium. My footsteps echoed on the flagstone floor of the entry hall, each sound swallowed by the cavernous space. I could have sworn, for a moment, that one of them detached itself, slipping behind a heavy velvet curtain before I could properly focus. Must be the exhaustion, I told myself. The long drive playing tricks. I chose a room on the second floor, one with a four-poster bed draped in what looked like moth-eaten silk. The mattress sagged, but the sheets, though yellowed, were clean. Alara, it seemed, had left everything in a peculiar state of suspended animation. It was too indistinct to make out words, just a soft, sibilant sigh that seemed to emanate from the very plaster. I pulled back, shaking my head. Old houses creak. Old houses settle. My mind was just overactive. Sleep offered little respite. I woke repeatedly, convinced I heard movement in the hall or a soft scratching from within the walls themselves. The next morning, armed with a lukewarm cup of coffee and a growing sense of unease, I began a more thorough exploration. The house was a labyrinth of dim corridors and forgotten rooms, each filled with its own peculiar collection of curiosities, taxidermied birds with glassy eyes, shelves overflowing with ancient, leather-bound books on botany and folklore, and strange, intricate tapestries depicting impossible flora. The air grew progressively warmer, more humid, as I ventured deeper into the manor's heart. The earthy scent intensified, growing sweeter, almost cloying. This wasn't just another room. This was the conservatory. It was vast, a towering edifice of glass and wrought iron, now mostly obscured by an explosive profusion of plant life. Sunlight, filtered through grime-streaked panes, dappled the enormous leaves and trailing vines that choked every available space. It was a jungle alive and breathing within the confines of the manor, and it was beautiful in a terrifying, untamed way. But this wasn't just any garden. The plants here were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Some had leaves that shimmered with unnatural metallic hues. Others bore flowers with intricate, almost anatomical patterns, their petals unfurling like delicate, crimson mouths. Not wind, not settling wood. They were low, rustling sounds, like dry leaves being dragged across stone, but with an undeniable rhythm, almost like a chorus of hushed voices. I took a step deeper, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth that covered the flagstones. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Had it moved? Or was it just the play of light? I stared at it, unblinking, until my eyes watered. It remained still, but the air around it felt charged, expectant. It wasn't words, not yet, but a sustained, low hum that vibrated through the soles of my feet, up my legs, settling in my chest. My gaze swept across the verdant chaos, searching for a source, a reason, and then I saw it. Deep within the conservatory, where the light struggled to penetrate, a massive, gnarled root system emerged from the earth, thicker than any tree trunk I had ever encountered. It wasn't just a root, it was a sprawling, organic mass that seemed to merge with the very foundations of the manor, disappearing into the walls, twisting upwards toward the distant glass ceiling. Its surface was a mosaic of mottled greens and browns, occasionally punctuated by strange, fungal growths that resembled clusters of pallid, blind eyes. As I watched, one of these growths, high on the root mass, seemed to expand, stretching outwards, almost imperceptibly like a slow yawn. A faint, sweetish odor, sickly and intoxicating, wafted towards me. The conservatory, this beautiful, terrible place, was not merely overgrown. It was alive, and it was listening. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on that pulsing, rooted mass until my heel caught on something unseen. I stumbled, recovering my balance with a gasp. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to flee, to put as much distance between myself and this house as possible. But where would I go? There was no escape. Not really. Not from this. The old sedan had finally given up its ghost in the drive, leaving me to the unsettling quiet of the Pacific Northwest. Blackwood Manor. My great-aunt Alara had spent her life here, a reclusive botanist, and now her legacy was mine. A strange pull, subtle at first, then insistent, drew me deeper into the estate. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. The path, if you could call it that, dissolved into a choked tangle of thorny bushes and gnarled, leafless trees. I pushed through, the branches snagging at my jacket, the ground underfoot becoming a treacherous mix of cracked flagstones and invasive roots that snaked like pale veins. The fog, a constant companion in this part of the world, thickened here, muffling all sound, swallowing the edges of the world until I could only see a few feet ahead. It was like stepping into a different dimension of the estate, one deliberately hidden. The air grew still, cold and damp, pressing against my skin. The vegetation here was different. Harsher, more aggressive, barbed wire, rusted and barely visible, strewn between crumbling posts, seemed to rise out of the fog, forming a perimeter. Beyond it, a vast, flat expanse of gravel, now mostly cracked and overgrown with a stubborn, grayish moss, stretched out. The fog swirled across it, obscuring the far boundaries, creating an illusion of endless, empty space. The feeling of being watched intensified, the silence here profound, heavy with unspoken things. No birds sang, no wind rustled the strange, stiff leaves. I felt exposed, vulnerable, despite the fog's embrace. My breath plumed in front of me, a fleeting ghost. I didn't linger. I found a break in the perimeter, a rusted gate half swallowed by ivy, and pushed through. On the other side, the atmosphere shifted again. The air grew warmer, humid, and the strange, sweet metallic scent intensified, almost cloying. The conservatory, the heavy oak door warped with age and humidity, groaned in protest as I forced it open. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft thud, sealing me in. This wasn't a garden, it was a jungle, a sprawling, chaotic riot of plant life I'd never seen before, or at least, not like this. Towering fronds, emerald and obsidian, dripped moisture onto the tiled floor. Vines as thick as my arms snaked across the ceiling, their tendrils dangling like inquisitive fingers. Some plants pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, casting a sickly, greenish glow on their neighbors. Others were a deep, unsettling crimson, their petals unfurling like fleshy mouths. There were no paths, only narrow tunnels carved by Alara's meticulous, yet clearly deranged pruning. My hand brushed against a broad, slick leaf, and I pulled it back instinctively. It felt oddly warm, almost alive, like skin. The entire structure seemed to breathe with the plants. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the grimy glass ceiling, illuminating the bizarre architecture of this botanical nightmare. I found a clearing, a small, circular space dominated by a gnarled, tree-like specimen with bark like petrified bone and leaves that shimmered with an oily sheen. Beneath it sat a heavy, oak desk, half buried under a cascade of vines. This must have been Alara's sanctuary. On the desk, beneath a layer of dust and a scattering of dried, unidentified pods, I found them. A stack of leather-bound journals, their covers embossed with a stylized, swirling pattern that looked disturbingly like roots. I picked one up, the leather cool and smooth beneath my fingers. Alara's neat, spidery handwriting filled the pages. The early entries were typical botanical notes, observations on growth cycles and soil composition. But as I flipped through, the tone shifted. Dates became erratic. The handwriting grew more frantic, the ink bleeding in places. The growth responds. It learns, not merely a plant, but an entity of consciousness. My breath hitched. I turned another page. The root. It anchors everything. The manor vessel. I understand now. Alara hadn't just been a botanist, he had been a caretaker, a devotee. Her observations grew less scientific, more spiritual, almost devotional. She spoke of its hunger, its need for expansion, and the sacrifice required. The air in the conservatory, already thick with humidity, suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. The strange, sweet scent now seemed to carry a hint of something metallic, something like blood. I looked around at the pulsating, breathing flora, seeing them not as plants, but as tendrils of a vast, unseen organism. Blackwood Manor wasn't just a house with a peculiar garden. It was its root system, and Alara, my great aunt, had been its willing gardener. It hungers. It calls for a new host. The seeds are sown. Soon, it will take root. A faint rustle came from the dense foliage behind me, a sound that wasn't the wind, not a drip of water. It was too deliberate, too close. I gripped the journal, my knuckles white, the words echoing in my mind. I stared at my palm, then the back of it, turning it over and over. No rash, no insect bite, no stray leaf fragment, just smooth skin, pale and unremarkable, yet the feeling was undeniably there, like a single, unseen thread being drawn taut just beneath the surface. The implication, though unstated, was clear and cold. I slammed the journal shut. The heavy leather thudded against the mahogany desk, a sound that felt too loud, too violent in the hushed room. This was ridiculous. I was letting old papers and an isolated house get to me. Grief, isolation, a vivid imagination. That was all it was. I needed fresh air, a connection to the outside world. I pushed away from the desk, the antique chair groaning in protest. As I turned, a small, polished wooden box, the one I'd noticed on the mantelpiece, containing a collection of dried, unfamiliar seeds, slid an inch perhaps two, to the left, just enough to catch my eye. Had I nudged the desk? No, I'd been careful. The box sat flush against the stone. I watched it for a long moment, my eyes narrowed, my breathing shallow. It didn't move again. The air in the room felt thick and still heady with dust and the scent of aged paper. I walked over, my boots making no sound on the thick rug, and gently pushed the box back into place. My fingers brushed the cool, smooth wood. It felt inert, a faint scraping, rhythmic and insistent, from somewhere deep within the walls. This was deliberate, almost like a dry branch being dragged across stone, or something with many tiny legs scuttling across a rough surface. I froze mid-step, my head cocked. The sound stopped the moment I acknowledged it. I waited, holding my breath until my lungs ached, but it didn't return. Only the vast, empty quiet of the manor. I needed to see something familiar, something that made sense. I walked to the dining room, a cavernous space I hadn't properly explored. A grand, ornate mirror hung on the far wall, reflecting the room back at me in a warped, distorted panorama. The silvered glass was old, speckled with age spots, but otherwise clear. I approached it, my reflection emerging from the gloom. The house was getting to me, draining me. As I drew closer, something flickered, not in the room itself, but in the reflection. For a split second, the background behind my reflected self wasn't the dining room. It was a bleak, gray expanse under a sky the color of a bruise. Fences, stark and skeletal, stretched into the distance, shrouded in an impenetrable mist. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the familiar, dusty opulence of the dining room. My own face stared back at me, a mask of pure shock. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my chest, trying to calm the frantic thrumming beneath my ribs. It had been so real. Too real to be a trick of the light, too vivid to be my imagination. The house wasn't just old, it was distorting reality. It was showing me things, hinting at something horrific. I felt watched, not by eyes, not by a single point of focus, but by the very fabric of the house itself. The walls themselves felt like they were leaning in, the ceiling pressing down. The house was a living, breathing entity, and I was its prey. Or at least, I needed to connect. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone. No signal, not a single bar. I swore under my breath, my frustration boiling over. I tried again, walking to a window, then another, then even up to the attic. The screen remained stubbornly blank where the signal indicator should have been. I remember the old landline phone in the study, a relic with a rotary dial. I rushed back, my footsteps echoing unnervingly fast. I picked up the receiver. I tried a few times, slamming the receiver back into its cradle with growing desperation, but it was useless. Internet then. There had to be an old modem something. I scoured the study, pulling out drawers, rummaging through old documents. No router, no wires, no sign of any modern connection. Elara, the reclusive botanist, had clearly lived off the grid. My hands began to tremble. I was cut off. Completely. The house had swallowed me whole, severing every connection to the outside. It wasn't just isolated. It was actively isolating me. The house wasn't merely a place, it was a trap. And I was the new host it was patiently, malevolently preparing for. I rubbed it, scratched at it, even held it under cold water, but nothing offered relief. It wasn't a physical sensation. Not really. As the long Pacific Northwest twilight bled into true night, the sensation intensified, a tiny, insistent drummer tapping out a rhythm of dread. Sleep offered no escape. It merely provided a new stage for the creeping invasion. My dreams became a kaleidoscope of the conservatory. The plants, usually silent and still, writhed and pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I saw the thick, fibrous vines, their surfaces slick with moisture, stretching and contracting like muscles. The air in the dream was heavy with the cloying sweetness of decaying blossoms, a scent that caught in my throat and burned my sinuses. Within the swirling gray, skeletal structures of what might have once been watchtowers loomed, their metal rusting, their concrete crumbling. And everywhere, pushing through the cracked pavement, climbing the rusted fences, were the same grotesque plants from the conservatory. Their leaves were a sickly, phosphorescent green, their roots tearing through the very foundations of the yard as if trying to consume the architecture itself. The fog thickened, pressing in, and I could hear a faint, rhythmic thump, 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 like a heartbeat, or perhaps something far older, far more rooted, pushing its way through the earth. I tried to scream, but the fog filled my mouth, tasting of decay and damp soil. I woke abruptly, gasping, the taste of soil lingering on my tongue. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull thud against the mattress. I swung my legs out of bed, needing to shake off the remnants of that suffocating vision. The itch on my hand was still there, a low hum beneath my skin. Days blurred into a cycle of restless sleep and waking unease. The phantom itch wasn't confined to my hand anymore. It spread, a subtle, almost imperceptible crawling sensation sensation across my scalp, down my spine, sometimes even behind my eyes. I'd find myself scratching unconsciously, my nails dragging across my skin, leaving faint red marks. The hallucinations started subtly. Once, I swore I saw a thin, coiling vine slither across the floorboards of the hallway, only for it to vanish the instant I focused on it. Another time, the faint, sweet, sickly scent of the conservatory plants would waft through the library, even with the doors firmly shut. I'd sniff the air, convinced I could pinpoint its source, but it would always dissipate, leaving behind only the scent of old paper and dust. I started to question my own perceptions, my own sanity. There was the isolation getting to me. There was the grief, still a raw wound, finally cracking my mind. One afternoon, while searching for a misplaced journal in Alara's study, a room I'd mostly avoided due to its heavy, stagnant air, I noticed something peculiar. Tucked away on a high shelf behind a stack of brittle leather-bound volumes was a small, ornate wooden box. It wasn't like anything else in the room. It seemed almost out of place amidst the scientific instruments and botanical sketches. The box was surprisingly light, smooth beneath my fingertips. I brought it down, its polished surface catching the dim light filtering through the grime-streaked window. There was no lock, only a delicate silver clasp. My fingers fumbled with it, a strange urgency building in my chest. When it clicked open, a soft, ethereal glow emanated from within. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, fibrous moss, was a single, perfect sphere. It was no larger than a marble, its surface a milky, translucent white, but it pulsed with a faint, internal light, a soft, bioluminescent green that waxed and waned like a slow breath. It felt alive, a single tiny spore, yet it radiated an energy that hummed against my fingertips. As I held it, a profound sense of calm washed over me, displacing the gnawing anxiety. It was an unsettling calm, though not a natural one. My gaze was fixed on the glowing orb, unable to tear away. It called to me, a silent, powerful summons. I didn't just want to observe it, I wanted to nurture it, to protect it, to keep it close. My fingers, almost without conscious thought, closed around the small, glowing orb. Its light seeped through my skin, a subtle warmth spreading through my palm. And now, it was my turn. The mystery wasn't just about what was happening to the house, it was about what was happening to me. The line between my own thoughts and the influence of this ancient, growing thing was blurring, fading into an indistinguishable, terrifying hum. I gripped the spore tighter, feeling a primal, possessive instinct rise within me. It felt right. It felt inevitable. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. It wasn't a physical sensation, not really something trying to get in. My skin prickled, not just on my hand, but across my scalp, down my spine. The house felt colder, heavier, as if the air itself had gained density. I needed answers, and I knew where to find them. Alara's study, preserved in a sepulchral hush, held the bulk of her journals. I'd only skimmed them before, dismissing them as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. Now, with the manor's strange growths pressing in and this invasive itch gnawing at me, I knew I had to truly read them. The leather-bound volumes, some brittle with age, others remarkably fresh, were stacked haphazardly on a dust-laden desk. Her handwriting, initially precise and elegant, grew increasingly frantic in later entries, scrawling across the pages like vines themselves. I picked up the oldest one, its spine cracked, and settled into a heavy armchair, the springs groaning in protest. Her early entries were meticulous observations of botanical life. She catalogued species, noted growth patterns, and waxed poetic about the resilience of nature. There was a passion there, a genuine love for her work that I could understand. Then, a subtle shift. August 14th, not auditory, not truly, more a resonance, a vibration within the roots, a sympathetic hum in the very air of the conservatory. The cryptostemma seems to be reaching, not for light, but for resonance. Alara was a botanist, not a mystic. I flipped pages, skipping ahead, my gaze snagging on increasingly unsettling passages. September 3rd, they respond, not with words, no, but with a palpable presence. A hunger. The tendrils shift when I enter the room, not randomly, but with a deliberate, almost expectant motion. They are aware. They are collective. What did she mean? I gripped the journal tighter, the old leather creaking. October 19th, the manor itself is the vessel. Its stones are the bones, its soil the flesh, and the roots are the nerves. It desires sustenance, a specific kind. The ordinary nutrients no longer suffice. It demands something deeper, something more alive. The words swam before my eyes. My heart hammered, a dull drum against my ribs. Demands something deeper, something more alive. What did that even mean? I turned more pages, the scent of aged paper and something vaguely earthy, almost feral, rising from the journal. Her handwriting was now barely legible, slashed across the paper with desperate force. November 28th, the hunger grows. My own vitality wanes, yet the manor thrives. It tells me of its purpose, of the great tapestry it weaves, of the new forms it will birth. I am merely the conduit, the gardener, the provider. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Alara wasn't just tending a garden, he was feeding the manor. And the plants, these strange, organic growths that infested the estate, they weren't mere botanical specimens. They were extensions of a singular, sentient entity. The manor itself was its root system, its consciousness, and Alara, in her isolation and obsession, had become its caretaker, its unwitting accomplice. December 15th, the offering. It must be made for the growth, for the consciousness. The new host will understand. They always do. The manor demands. And this wasn't just madness. This was something far more ancient and terrifying. Alara hadn't simply lost her mind. He had surrendered it, piece by piece, to this thing growing beneath Blackwood Manor. And he had spoken of a new host. My gaze flickered to my itching hand, the sensation now a burning, persistent ache that felt like something burrowing deeper. The springs of the armchair groaned again, though I hadn't moved. The air grew impossibly thick, scented with rich, damp soil and something else, something sweet and sickly, like decay. I wasn't just reading Alara's descent into madness. I was experiencing the very thing that had consumed her. The plants weren't just in the walls. They were of the walls, and they knew I was here. They knew I was reading, and they were listening. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the thought, but it was already too late. I could feel it, deep within the manor's foundations, a vast, silent hunger stirring awake. And I was the new host. This wasn't just madness. This was something far more ancient and terrifying, thing growing beneath Blackwood Manor. And he had spoken of a new host. My gaze flickered from the last, frantic entry in her journal to my own trembling hands. The ink on the page seemed to writhe, the words a silent scream. I spent the next hour poring over the cryptic scrawls, my mind reeling. Alara's later entries weren't coherent narratives, but fragments, sketches, and what looked like crude maps. They spoke of the heart, the roots that bind, and the veins of the earth. One particular sketch, a crude cross-section of the manor, showed a labyrinthine network extending deep below the foundation, culminating in a central chamber marked with an unnerving, almost biological symbol. A spiral, but not a clean, mathematical one. It was organic, like a fungal growth seen under a microscope. The sense of urgency clawed at my throat. If Alara had indeed been preparing a new host, and if that host was me, then I couldn't afford to hesitate. If there were hidden passages, Alara would have left clues, however obscure. I remembered her obsession with the house's original blueprints, stored in a dusty trunk in the attic. I climbed the creaking stairs to the attic, the air thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something vaguely earthy and sweet like decaying blossoms. The trunk was where I had left it, tucked away in a corner beneath a shroud of cobwebs. Inside, under piles of forgotten linens, I found the rolled-up parchments. They were brittle with age, but the ink still held. I spread them out on the attic floor, tracing the lines with my finger. Most of the plans were standard, but one set, labeled Original Foundation, seemed to have been heavily annotated by Alara. Faint red lines, almost invisible unless you knew to look, crisscrossed certain sections, highlighting an area directly beneath the main hall. A small, almost imperceptible X marked a spot near the grand fireplace. This wasn't excitement. It was a prelude to something I knew would be profoundly disturbing. I grabbed a powerful flashlight and a small crowbar, my hand feeling the solid weight of the metal. I ran my hands over the rough-hewn blocks, searching. The red X on the blueprint had been precise. My fingers found a faint seam, almost perfectly camouflaged, in the stonework just behind the cast iron grate. It wasn't a natural fissure. With a grunt, I wedged the crowbar into the seam. The stone didn't budge easily. I pushed, pulled, strained, my muscles aching. Then, with a low groan that seemed to echo through the very bones of the house, a section of the hearth shifted inward. It was the same smell I'd noticed in the attic, only stronger, more potent. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. I hesitated for a breath, the image of Alara's mad scrawl burning in my mind. The passage sloped sharply downwards, the air growing heavier with each step. I descended further, the passage twisting and turning, disorienting me. My flashlight beam danced across a sight that made my stomach clench. This wasn't rock. This was organic. The entire cavern was a pulsating, living network. Great, rope-like roots, thicker than my torso, snaked across the floor and up the walls, crisscrossing the ceiling like immense, fibrous arteries. They weren't brown or black, but a sickly, translucent gray, shot through with faint green veins that seemed to glow with an internal light. Between the roots, enormous fungal growths erupted from the damp earth, vast, shelf-like structures of pallid white, and bulbous, iridescent mushrooms that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent throb. The air here was almost viscous, thick with spores, and the musky, sweet scent was overpowering, almost intoxicating. The low hum I'd heard earlier intensified, a deep, guttural thrum that resonated in my teeth, a sound that felt less heard and more felt. It was the sound of something vast, something ancient, breathing. And at the very center of the cavern, where all the great roots converged, was a colossal, bulbous mass. It was impossibly large, a gray-green mound of flesh and fiber covered in a network of smaller, pulsating veins. It seemed to expand and contract with the rhythm of the hum, a slow, deliberate beat like a monstrous heart. This was the heart, the true core of Blackwood Manor. And Alara, my great-aunt, hadn't just tended a garden, he had been tending this. Blackwood Manor wasn't just built on something. Blackwood Manor was something, and it was awake. My garden. The words echoed in the suffocating quiet of Alara's study. The journal clutched in my trembling fingers. Not her garden. Not the sprawling, tangled mess outside. My garden. The implication settled over me like a shroud woven from dread. Alara hadn't just lost her mind. He had offered it piece by piece to this parasitic entity. And now it wanted me. The wood groaned, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, up into my very bones. The air in the study thickened, acquiring a cloying, earthy scent, like overturned soil mixed with something sickly sweet and metallic. It filled my nose, coating the back of my throat. My stomach churned. I tried to focus on the familiar details of the room, the leather-bound books, the faded tapestry, but they seemed to shimmer, their edges blurring as if seen through a heat haze. A low thrum began, a vibration that started deep beneath the house and resonated through the soles of my boots. It wasn't a mechanical hum. It felt organic, like the slow, steady pulse of something immense and deeply rooted. It spoke of pressure, of things expanding in confined spaces, pushing against ancient stone. The sound resonated with a deep, unsettling part of me, a primal chord that sent a shiver down my spine, but also a strange, almost comforting hum through my chest. No, I whispered, the word thin and reedy in the suddenly cavernous room. I closed my eyes, trying to clear the scent from my nostrils, the vibrations from my skull. When I opened them, the study was gone. A raw, biting wind tore at my clothes, carrying the taste of ash and something acrid. Thick fog, the color of old milk, swirled around my knees, obscuring anything beyond a few feet. The air here was heavy, laden with a sense of immense, unyielding despair. This wasn't Blackwood Manor. This was somewhere else, or some time else. My mind reeled, grasping for an anchor. The face of the officer, his eyes grim, his voice a low rumble delivering the inevitable. The metallic taste in my mouth, the ringing in my ears. It was all here, amplified, distorted. A figure emerged from the swirling gray, indistinct at first, then coalescing into a form I knew intimately. It was a driver, head bowed, shoulders slumped, walking towards a door in the wall that wasn't there before. But his face was wrong. Not the face of the man from the other car, nor the face of the reporting officer. He didn't look up, just kept walking, a slow, shuffling gait, as if every step was an unbearable burden. What? I called out, my voice ragged. The figure didn't react, didn't turn. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, a familiar vibration. It wasn't the concrete of the yard, it was the deep, resonant thrum of the manor, overlaid with the memory of metal twisting, glass shattering. The fog itself pulsed, taking on a greenish tint, like something alive and breathing. The figure of the driver, my own haunted reflection, dissolved into the mist, and the door in the wall seemed to swell, its surface becoming fibrous, woody, like the bark of an ancient tree. It stretched, pushing against the concrete, cracking it with a slow, agonizing groan. They were everywhere, beneath the yard, within the walls, reaching, grasping. You belong here, Blake. You always have. They played on my guilt, on the crushing weight I carried, promising solace, release. I fought the insidious pull, the feeling of belonging that was trying to bloom in the barren landscape of my grief. This wasn't solace, it was surrender. This wasn't healing, it was absorption. My hands flew to my ears, but the voice wasn't external. It was inside me, a parasite burrowing into my thoughts. The concrete shattered, revealing more of the vast, living network beneath. The walls groaned, stretching higher, becoming impossibly tall, like the gnarled trunks of colossal, unseen trees. I gasped, choking on the particulate air. The thrum intensified, becoming a roar that vibrated through every cell of my body. It was the sound of something waking, something vast and ancient, eager for its new host. My sanity was unraveling, thread by thread, and the root was pulling each one. The insidious whispers from the roots had burrowed deep, promising a cessation of pain, an end to the gnawing guilt. This wasn't solace, it was surrender. This wasn't an escape, it was an absorption. My great-tante Laura hadn't found peace in its tendrils. He had become one with its hunger, and I would not follow her into that oblivion. A defiant fury ignited in my chest, a desperate, animalistic will to survive. I would fight. I stumbled back from the central mass, my breath ragged, my mind racing. I needed something. An axe. There was an old woodshed out back, filled with rusted tools. Every floorboard groaned beneath my weight. Every draft of cold air felt like a spectral breath. I imagined the roots beneath the floor, slithering, extending, listening. There it was, leaning against a workbench, its head dull with disuse, its handle worn smooth, a heavy felling axe. The earthy sweet smell was now tinged with something metallic, something sickly floral, like an overripe bloom. The blade bit deep into the fibrous mass, a sickening thwack echoing in the humid space. It didn't smell like blood, but it felt just as vital. I swung again and again, grunting with effort. Each blow sent tremors through the dense network, a shudder running through the entire conservatory. The glass panes rattled overhead, and a shower of fine dust drifted down. I imagine I heard a low, guttural moan, not from the roots, but from the very structure of the house itself. Then, the resistance began. The tendrils, previously dormant, began to stir. Not just subtly, but actively. They uncoiled from the walls, slithered across the damp floor, their tips reaching, probing. A thicker root, one I hadn't noticed before, snapped out from behind a colossal fern, whipping past my ear with a sound like a bullet. I ducked, swinging the axe wildly, severing a thinner tendril that tried to wrap around my ankle. It writhed on the floor, like a dying snake, before slowly retracting into the damp earth. The attacks escalated. A thick, opaque fog began to seep in, not from outside, but manifesting within the glass structure, swirling around my legs, obscuring my vision. The earthy sweet scent was suddenly replaced by the acrid tang of damp concrete and rust like stale blood on old iron. The walls of the conservatory began to distort. The elegant lines of the glass panes warped, the steel framework twisting, stretching. The lush greenery around me faded, replaced by stark, gray surfaces. The fog thickened, swirling higher, until I was standing not in a conservatory, but in a vast, gray expanse. I could smell the metallic tang of chain link, the distant, muffled clang of heavy gates. Shades began to emerge from the swirling mist hall, imposing fences topped with barbed wire, watchtowers looming like skeletal giants. Tureo! I could almost hear the distant, disembodied shouts, the shuffle of many feet. The fog swirled closer, pressing in, stealing the air from my lungs. A figure materialized in the mist, indistinct, but its silhouette was agonizingly familiar. My personal tragedy, even form, haunting me. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound, and swung the axe at the illusion. The blade passed through the spectral figure, meeting no resistance, but the impact jarred my arm, making me stumble. The true roots, the real ones, seized their opportunity. A thick, ropey tendril, as wide as my forearm, shot out from the distorted ground. It wrapped around my leg with incredible speed and strength, yanking my feet out from under me. Another tendril, rough and unyielding, clamped down on my chest, pinning me. I struggled, gasping, the air forced from my lungs. The fog pressed in, blurring the line between the manor's attack and my own fractured memories. My vision swam. The prison yard, the conservatory, the tendrils, they all merged into one terrifying, suffocating reality. I was trapped, utterly and completely, caught between the entity's physical grasp and its insidious psychological torment. My eyelids grew heavy. The cold, damp earth beneath me was suddenly gone, replaced by the familiar scratch of my rough wool blanket. My eyes snapped open, the faint morning light filtering through the heavy curtains doing little to dispel the lingering terror. It wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. The dampness clinging to my skin, the faint acrid scent of mildew and something else, something green and fungal that seemed to permeate the very air of my bedroom, felt too real, too persistent to be a mere fabrication of sleep. The manor was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt pregnant with expectation, like the held breath before a scream. They didn't form words, not yet, but they spoke of a presence, a hungry, waiting thing. Oh, Laura! My great-aunt, he was the key he had to be. He had lived here, tended it, and ultimately, whatever this was, it had consumed her. Or so I had thought. I pushed myself out of bed, the floorboards groaning under my weight. This house, this thing, they was eating away at me, not just my sleep, but my very sense of self. I needed answers, and I knew where they might be, not in the main study, where I'd found her earlier journals, but somewhere more personal, more hidden. Her botanical workshop. The workshop, located in a remote wing of the manor, was a labyrinth of dried specimens, dusty glass jars, and a lingering scent of soil and strange, sweet decay. I had only ever glanced inside, finding it too unsettling, too much like a mausoleum for forgotten life. But now, it called to me with a perverse urgency. The air grew heavier as I approached, thick with the same organic aroma that clung to my skin, a scent that was becoming sickeningly familiar. Inside, the light was dim, choked by the overgrown vines that pressed against the windows, their tendrils tapping softly, incessantly, like skeletal fingers. I moved through the room, past desiccated flower presses and shelves laden with unlabeled bottles. My gaze fell upon a heavy oak desk, its surface scarred and stained. Beneath a pile of brittle, yellowed botanical sketches, I found it. Its pages were thick, handmade paper, faintly textured. This was it, her final journal. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The handwriting was Alara's, undeniably, but it was wilder, more sprawling than her earlier entries. The ink bled slightly in places as if applied with too much pressure or with a hand shaking with fervor. The first entries detailed her observations of the root, as he had come to call it. She spoke of its intelligence, its vast network, its ancient consciousness. But then, the tone shifted. The root does not merely consume. He had scrawled across one page, the words practically clawing at the paper. It integrates. It offers a communion, a transcendence beyond the limitations of the flesh. I see it now, the truth of its purpose. It seeks not to destroy, but to become, to expand. And it needs a host, a vessel, a conduit to the world above ground, a consciousness to guide its slow, deliberate awakening. My breath hitched. This wasn't a lament of a victim. This was the manifesto of a devotee. They speak of unity, of sacrifice, yes, but not in the way the ignorant would understand. It is a giving, a melting. My blood, my mind, my very essence will nourish it, become part of its grand design. And in return, I will know true belonging. I will be everywhere, feel everything, perceive the world through a thousand roots and tendrils. I swallowed, my throat dry and constricted. She wasn't just tending a garden. He was tending something else. And she hadn't merely succumbed. He had chosen to become one with it. A willing participant. Not mad in the way I'd imagined, but mad with a terrifying, ecstatic devotion. She believed this was enlightenment and evolution. The final entry was barely legible, a chaotic sprawl of ink that bled through the thin paper. The ritual is simple, yet profound. A return to the earth, a joining. The manor breathes with anticipation. It knows, it demands, and soon, the new steward will arrive. The bloodline is strong, the connection undeniable. He will understand. He must understand. The root hungers for a new consciousness, a new connection. My Blake, my legacy, my final gift to the garden. My Blake, my final gift. The book slipped from my numb fingers, clattering softly to the floor. The horror that washed over me was not just for Alara, but for myself. She hadn't just been consumed. He had orchestrated her own sacrifice, believing it was a glorious communion, and he had left it all for me. It wasn't just the house demanding my attention. It was it. The root. It wanted me. It expected me to follow Alara's path, to complete her ritual, to become the next willing host. The choice, Alara had called it. To go. Become one? Or what? It was a promise, a threat, an invitation. No, I wouldn't. I couldn't. Alara's madness might have led her to embrace this monstrous symbiosis, but I saw it for what it was, a slow, suffocating horror. My personal tragedy had left me broken, but not so broken that I would surrender to this. My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms. There had to be another way. A final, desperate means of escape. I would not be its new host. I would fight. My Blake, my final gift. The words, cold and sharp as splintered bone, echoed in the sudden, absolute silence of the workshop. The book, heady with Alara's final, horrifying truth, slipped from my numb fingers, clattering softly to the dust-laden floorboards. The horror that washed over me was not just for Alara, for her grotesque sacrifice, but for myself. She hadn't just been consumed. He had orchestrated her own demise, a gardener tending her final, most monstrous crop. And I, her unwitting inheritor, was the next seed. A low groan rumbled through the floor, a sound that resonated deep within my chest, vibrating through my bones. It wasn't the house settling. It was the house waking, stretching, preparing for its next meal. My breath hitched, tasting the decay on my tongue. I stumbled back, my eyes darting around the workshop. The shelves, once filled with Alara's arcane botanical equipment, now seemed to press in, their shadows elongating, writhing with unseen life. The workshop door, which had been slightly ajar, now stood firmly closed, the latch clicking with a wet, organic sound. This wasn't just a house, it was a hungry, sentient trap. It was slick, coated in a thin, viscous film that smelled faintly of mushrooms and blood. I twisted, pulled, shoved, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt as if thick, fibrous roots had woven themselves into the frame, binding it shut. The cracks between them were no longer just dust-filled gaps. Thin, hair-like filaments, translucent and pale green, had begun to sprout, weaving themselves into a delicate, intricate web. They pulsed with the same slow rhythm as the door, stretching and contracting like tiny capillaries. The workshop was no longer a room. It was a nascent organ, part of a larger, voracious body. I turned, desperate, searching for another exit. A small, grimy window looked out onto what I knew was the overgrown rear garden. I slammed my fist against the pane, but the glass felt unnervingly soft, yielding slightly under the impact, like hardened jelly. The walls began to weep. It traced slow, viscous paths down the wallpaper, collecting in glistening beads before dripping onto the floor, where the fibrous tendrils greedily absorbed it. The air grew warmer, humid, like a greenhouse after a storm, but a greenhouse filled with the stench of death. I had to get out. The idea of becoming another Alara, another feeder for this monstrous organism, ignited a furious determination within me. I wasn't going to just lie down and be consumed. I scrambled out of the workshop. Not through the door, but through a gaping hole that had appeared in the far wall, where a cupboard had once stood. The wood had simply dissolved, leaving a passage that pulsed with soft, bioluminescent light, like a vein. It led into a labyrinthine corridor I didn't recognize, a hallway that seemed to stretch and twist, its walls undulating with unseen pressure. My name, Blake, repeated over and over, not in Alara's voice, but in a chorus of ancient, sighing voices, a symphony of forgotten hosts. They promised peace, belonging, an end to suffering. They promised life, not as myself, but as part of something vast and eternal. I ran, my boots squelching on the damp, spongy floor. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in my head, the feeling of something trying to pry open the chambers of my mind. I burst through a final curtain of thick, rubbery tendrils and found myself in what I knew was the manor's central courtyard. But it was utterly transformed. The fog was so dense, so absolute, that the manor's towering structure was reduced to indistinct, monstrous silhouettes. I couldn't see the gate, couldn't see the path to freedom. The very air was heavy, tasting of confinement and damper. Every breath felt like inhaling liquid fear. It showed me visions. Alara, serene and smiling, her body entwined with roots, her eyes glowing with a placid, terrifying contentment. It showed me myself peaceful, merged, free from the torment of my past. Let go, Blake. Let go. Become. No. The word was a defiant roar, even if it only echoed in the confines of my own skull. I wouldn't surrender. I wouldn't become a part of this monstrous garden. I squinted through the fog, desperately trying to discern any direction, any sign of an exit. I could feel them, a phantom pressure against my ankles trying to trip me, to pull me down into the churning earth. Then, through a momentary thinning of the fog, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light, a sliver of distant gray that hinted at the manor's perimeter wall, and beyond it, the faint promise of the wild, untamed woods. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was a chance. My legs churned through the viscous mud, slipping on the slick, living roots. The fog swirled around me, disorienting, trying to swallow me whole. A searing pain shot through my left arm, just above the elbow. I cried out, stumbled, but didn't look back. I just ran, driven by an instinct more primal than fear. The pain was a burning throb, a deep ache that radiated through my entire limb. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I hit the perimeter wall, a solid, rough stone structure that felt like salvation. I scrambled over it, scraping my hands raw on the jagged rocks, not caring about the pain. I dropped to the other side, landing hard on the damp forest floor. I didn't stop running until the manor was a distant, indistinct silhouette swallowed by the fog and the trees. I ran until my lungs screamed and my legs gave out, collapsing against the trunk of a towering cedar. My body shook, racked with tremors, and my breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps. I was out. I had escaped Blackwood Manor. I pushed myself up, my left arm still throbbing with an insistent, deep-seated ache. I looked down, my blood turning to ice. It wasn't a cut or a bruise. It was a tiny, intricate pattern, like a miniature root system, etched beneath my skin. I had escaped the manor, yes, but the manor, or a piece of its enduring horror, had not let go of me. It had taken root. They were just quieter now, a low hum beneath my skin, waiting. The root had found a new host.